International Peace, where he helped conceive and design a bipartisan task force project on a foreign policy for the middle class. He also held teaching posts at Yale Law School, Dartmouth College, and the University of New Hampshire. He co-founded and co-chaired the advisory board for National Security Action, a nonprofit national security advocacy organization, and served on the advisory boards of another number of organizations involved in foreign policy and national security. He was a senior policy advisor on Joe Biden's 2020 presidential campaign. He holds a BA in political science and international studies from Yale College, a master's in philosophy and international relations from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and a JD from Yale Law School. He clerked for Judge Stephen Breyer of the Supreme Court and Judge Guido Calabrese of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. The format today will be a conversation. We're delighted to have club member and Vice Chair Emeritus Bob Hormats doing the honors of moderating. Bob is the former Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. In addition, we have open Q&A here in the room for our members and their guests, as well as a chat box for those on Zoom who wish to submit a question for consideration. As a reminder, this conversation is on the record. We do have plenty of media today, both online and in the room. So, Bob, if you're ready, we'll pass this over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. Jake, great to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
We had a lot of good times together, interesting times. Glad to see you back in Washington and this terrific job that you're doing so well. So thanks for coming and joining us. I'd like to start with a broad question of how we think about the global economic order. Right after World War II, a few of the large developed countries, democracies, built a global order, which has served, I think, the world quite well over the years. The problem we face now is that democracy is under challenge in various parts of the world, including parts of our own country. How do we take this period of substantial change and the pressures that the global order is facing in the current environment and exercise the kind of leadership we exercised 70 or so years ago? What kind of order do you see emerging from this? I know you've that order was sort of IMF, World Bank, big global systems. You've now developed a lot of more focused regional systems to enable us to push our ideas and organize countries in somewhat smaller groups. How do you see the global order evolving over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
Well, first I would say that the international economic order that was built after the end of the Second World War had many substantial successes in terms of improving both global macroeconomic stability and helping bring a heck of a lot of people out of poverty. And we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it is definitely the case that in the year 2022, we need to update both the rules of the road and the institutions for global economic cooperation. And the approach that the Biden administration has taken is essentially in 3 steps. The first step is to really reinforce the fundamental foundation of like-minded democratic market economies and develop a common agenda with those countries to drive towards a set of economic outcomes that end up really delivering for people both in our own societies and around the world on everything from how we make sure to grow and expand the middle class to how we address difficult economic challenges from food security to energy security to the energy and climate transition. So the president has put a lot of effort into really revitalizing and rejuvenating the G7 as a kind of steering committee for the free world after years in which the G7 was a little bit listless and uncertain about where its direction. The second step is to engage a broader set of emerging economies to deal with a set of challenges that no one country can deal with on their own. And that's what this G20 summit will be all about. And if you look at these big questions of food and energy and sovereign debt, the impacts and the continuing effects of the pandemic and how we have to be prepared for the next pandemic, fundamentally, this larger project is about delivering global public goods in a way that is sustainable, where responsibility is broadly shared, and where everybody can benefit. And the president is looking to make real progress at this G20 on those core issues that are not just on the front of government's minds, but on the front of the minds of regular families in this country and around the world. And then the third element is how to update the international financial institutions so they're actually up to the task that we face today. Secretary Yellen gave a major speech a couple of weeks ago on a reform of the multilateral development banks, including the World Bank. There is so much more upside available to us in terms of what we can do with the international financial institutions and multilateral development banks to deliver on these global public goods. An example of this that I would just point out is a facility that the World Bank put together a few years ago, small, but a good model for what we can do going forward, which is middle-income countries that don't historically have the opportunity to get financing at preferential rates the way the low-income countries do from multilateral development. We're given a window where those countries were particularly hard hit by the financial and other impacts of migration. And in parts of the Middle East and in parts of the Americas, you've seen countries, middle-income countries, be able to take advantage of that. How do we scale that? How do we apply that kind of model in other contexts, whether it's middle-income countries getting hit by climate or the public health effects that we see, not just from COVID, but from other communicable diseases? This is the kind of thing that we need to have a really robust, inclusive process of reform and updating for the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks. So across those three aspects, the Biden administration has been very focused. And the last thing that I would say is that the big project in the 60s, 70s, 80s was bringing tariffs down. It was about liberalization, reducing trade barriers. That was the general agreement on trade and tariffs, and ultimately the World Trade Organization. Today, the big challenge is less the size of the tariff in a given place. It's about everything the pandemic laid bare: resilient supply chains, how effectively we're going to, on the one hand, be able to ensure an adequate supply of energy on the market, and on the other hand, move towards a net zero future. How do we make sure that we are setting the rules of the road for emerging technologies in a way that enhances and enlivens freedom as opposed to suppresses it? A lot of other economic challenges that just weren't fundamentally part of the conversation 20, 30 years ago, but are central to the conversation today. And so we do have these new formats. We have the Trade and Technology Council with the European Union. We have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity. All are part of a variable geometry of getting at these new emerging challenges to the global economy in a way that can deliver broad-based benefits, but is fundamentally they are answering a different set of questions than the questions that the WTO and the original formulation of the IMF was answering. And that's not a bad thing. It's the world has thrown different questions at us today than it threw at us 50 years ago.
Thanks. You've raised an interesting point. You gave a very interesting speech, I guess, 2 months ago or so on these new technologies, these 21st century technologies. And there is a challenge for people in this room and people throughout the country. On one hand, these technologies like quantum or AI, microprocessors and such, they have an important strategic capability. And as a result, we have to protect them, and you're working hard, and others in the government are as well. On the other hand, there are a lot of companies that still are of the view that we sort of developed over the last 20 or 30 years, that if you develop closer trade ties or investment ties with certain countries, it'll help to strengthen relations and help to encourage reforms potentially. Hasn't demonstrated that so much yet, but that was at least the thought. Are we at a point now where we're going to have a world where this decoupling is going to apply more and more in the new technologies, in part for economic reasons, in part because they have such important security consequences? Or is there still room for companies in the non-security area that want to try to build economic ties with countries with whom we don't have particularly close relations, but they've been there for a while and think that over time, maybe things will change and maybe businesses will be able to play a constructive role?
Just think, in a world with the level of speed, complexity, and interconnectedness of global challenges that we face today, these broad binaries are just not very helpful. We have said quite explicitly, we're not seeking a new Cold War with China. Terms like decoupling, to me, speak in terms of extremes that do not actually correctly reflect the kind of strategic approach or the vision of what the Biden administration has put forward. Our national security strategy, which we released about a month ago, identifies the simple reality that China is at once a geopolitical competitor, one of our largest trading partners, and a country with whom we have to work towards solutions to common problems that no one country can solve on their own. All of those things are true at once. All of those have to be contended in the context of trying to put together an effective strategy. So yes, we will be unapologetic about taking steps to protect our national security and to put ourselves in the strongest possible position to compete vigorously, effectively, without having that competition turn over into conflict or confrontation. And the most recent steps that we took on export controls are really about what many people, many observers across the political spectrum have been talking about in the US-China relationship, this idea with technology controls of a small yard and a high fence. We're trying to actually put that into practice by identifying both the production and manufacture of certain types of chips that are used for national security applications that undermine the national security of the United States, placing restrictions on those while leaving a large segment, a substantial segment of the semiconductor market, let alone many, many other aspects of the US-China economic relationship outside of that yard. So we will continue to pursue tailored strategies to identify specific foundational technologies where we do believe there are real national security implications. And on the other hand, we will continue to stay focused on trying to work not just with the PRC, but with many other countries on enhancing overall global macroeconomic stability and on getting after some of these very significant global problems that everyone's going to have to contribute to. The United States is less than 15% of global emissions. China is a heck of a lot more than that. The climate crisis will not be solved without the PRC, and the United States is the first and second largest emitters. And there are other examples along those lines. So that's how we see it. We believe we're in a world where the two major strategic challenges of our time, renewed geopolitical competition and transnational problems that require collective action, should not be rank ordered. We have to do both at once as both fundamental national security interests of the United States. And that requires a kind of commitment to a firm set of principles on the one hand, but an adaptability, a flexibility, and a nimbleness to put together a strategy that is, sees the world for in the complex terms in which we have to find it, rather than try to reduce it to these simple binaries.
Do you think China buys into that strategy, or are we capable of encouraging them to do so?
Well, I guess it's hard for me to say precisely what their perspective will be as we go forward, because we've just come out of the 20th Party Congress. We now have this period before the meetings in the spring where this government will get new government and party leadership will get constituted. the work program that was put forward at the Congress be translated into policy. There will be many communications at many levels of our two governments. So we'll try to come to a better set of understandings of each other's perspectives and intentions over the course of the next few months. But I'm not going to make any predictions about how I think they'll approach it at this point, only to say that the United States has put forward in quite clear and straightforward terms. In fact, I think quite deeply candid terms in our national security strategy, what it is we're grappling with, how we're going about our approach, and what we want to see at the end of the day, which is a world in which we are competing vigorously and seeking to do very well in that competition, but at the same time that we're seeking to avoid conflict or confrontation, and we want to manage this relationship in a responsible way.
Thanks. You mentioned the period of time, for instance, in the Cold War. We're now facing what we never quite had during the Cold War, at least during parts of it. There were summits on a fairly regular basis and high-level meetings on a fairly regular basis. It seems now that it is difficult to maintain the kind of dialogues that we would like to have with a couple of countries, China and Russia in particular. Is there some communications process underway that enables us to get these countries to better understand the kind of system we want? Are we able to communicate at high enough levels to communicate the kind of vision that you've outlined in a way that they feel that it does not threaten their interests and in fact can enhance their interests?
Well, I would distinguish between Russia and the PRC for this purpose, because I think our engagement with those two countries is quite different.
Sure.
With the PRC, President Biden has had the opportunity to have face-to-face communication with Xi Jinping by video. They've not yet had the opportunity to meet in person because President Xi has only recently started leaving his home country, given COVID and what he's been dealing with the pandemic over the course of the past few years. But they have done multiple video conferences. They've spoken on the phone. And so the pattern of leader-to-leader communication that then leads to communication between Foreign Minister and Secretary of State, between myself and my counterpart, the Politburo Politburo member in charge of foreign affairs, and then other elements of our government being able to interact with the PRC. We have had, I think, pretty sustained communication, and also, most importantly, the opportunity to have strategic conversation. That is to say, for us to be able to step back and say, here is our perspective, here are our intentions, here's how we are approaching these issues, even when the conversation can get difficult because we have different views, different perspectives, or different values when it comes to certain areas of the relationship. And I think that will continue. The ability to have that sustained high-level communication is something we are committed to, and would hope that the PRC will also be committed to as we go forward. With respect to Russia, obviously it has been quite some time since there's been a telephone conversation, let alone a face-to-face meeting between the two presidents. But as I have said repeatedly, we have channels to communicate with the Russian Federation at senior levels. We have done so when it's been necessary to clarify potential misunderstandings and try to reduce risk and reduce the possibility of catastrophe like the potential use of nuclear weapons. We have done that. We have not been specific about what those channels are, although we do occasionally in some circumstances indicate conversations that take place, like the one between our defense minister or our Secretary of Defense and their defense minister and our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and their chief of defense. But we believe that at that kind of basic level of communication, we have channels that can continue to operate effectively to ensure that Russia has a very good understanding of where the United States stands, particularly on questions of risk reduction and issues like the consequences of the potential use of nuclear weapons.
Thanks. I'd like to follow up on the Ukraine-Russian issue, but first, going back to your point on China, are we able to have the kind of discussions that you've outlined on the issue of Taiwan, which seems to be the sort of flashpoint in the region, or potentially so, and possibilities for misunderstandings unless the communication is fairly clear and fairly precise? Have we been able to have a dialogue on that you think has been able to at least address some of the issues and the consequences of certain types of actions?
I won't deny it's a very difficult issue on which there have been, difficult conversations over the course of the past 2 years, but those conversations have been candid and direct and substantive. And so the answer to your question is yes. President Biden and President Xi have discussed the issue. I've discussed the issue in detail with my counterpart, Secretary Blinken with his counterpart. Since the elevated and aggressive actions of the Chinese military around Taiwan starting in August, we have not had the military-to-military communication that we believe can help create more stability and reduce the risk for misunderstanding. We hope to get that back on track. But more broadly, when it comes to our capacity to communicate and to have discussions about what our policy is, and our policy is quite straightforward and longstanding, and it hasn't changed. It's the One China policy and the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, and a fundamental commitment to maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and opposing any unilateral changes to the status quo or aggression, intimidation, and coercion that we find fundamentally destabilizing. We have been able to communicate that. And I believe for their part, the PRC has been able to communicate its perspective to us. So I don't think the issue there is one of communication.
Thank you. If you, going over back to the European side, George H.W. Bush years ago talked about a Europe whole and free. I wonder if you could share your thoughts on what Europe, or what we would like Europe to look like after this war is over, and recognizing that it's hard to figure out exactly how it's going to end, but what kind of Europe would you like to see emerge over the course of the next 5 or 10 years? And what role would Russia play in that Europe of the middle 21st century?
Well, the question of what role Russia would play is very much up to the choices that Russia makes, and whether it continues down the dark path it's on or chooses to take a different path. Fundamentally, though, our vision for Europe has not changed just because Vladimir Putin unleashed this aggressive and illegal war on Ukraine. It is and remains a Europe whole and free and at peace. And we would like to work in that direction actively. And in fact, if you go back to before this conflict started, the Russian government put forward this series of proposals, many elements of which were way beyond anything that was reasonable or realistic, but some of which got at a basic question of how do we increase stability and security in Europe? And we, the United States, in close consultation with NATO and in consultation with the government of Ukraine, put forward a series of responses. NATO put forward a paper, the United States put forward a paper, indicating we were prepared to have a meaningful discussion about a more stable and secure European theater and Euro-Atlantic theater. So we have made clear from well before the conflict in Ukraine broke out that the United States is prepared to contribute to that, but that we have a basic set of principles upon which we will stand. And those principles are not principles we invented. They're principles that every country in the world, including Russia, signed up to in the United Nations Charter. The respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, that you cannot conquer and seize and quote unquote annex your partner's territory by force, that you cannot go purchase drones from Iran and crash them into homes and civilian power generation facilities to try to terrorize a population. Basic principles that Russia has completely flouted. to the cost, the great human cost of the people of Ukraine, and to the cost of stability and security far beyond Ukraine in Europe. And so we will continue to work day in and day out to support the brave Ukrainian people as they seek to defend their sovereignty and redeem their territorial integrity. And we will work day in and day out to continue to impose costs on Russia for as long as it is operating in a way that is way outside the bounds of the basic international rules of the road that not just everyone else signed up to, but that Russia itself signed up to.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions from our audience or a few zoomed in questions. If there's anyone who would like to. Yes, please. Please stand up and identify yourself. And
Thank you for your time, and thank you for using the PRC as a distinctive term separating the government from the people. A slightly personal question. You being the Douglas National Security Advisor, probably go through your entire life, and this is the sort of a woman in higher. What's been your biggest learning on the job? Something you was proud of, and something you wish you could have done better?
So first, I'm actually not the youngest ever national security advisor. Second, I would point out, I believe you can fact check me on this. There are now 3 heads of government in the G7 younger than me. President Macron, Prime Minister Maloney, and Prime Minister Sunak. So I'm like now the old guy at the gatherings of many world leaders. It's a great question because we are at a moment, as I was saying before, where if you look back over the last few decades, the pendulum in U.S. foreign policy has tended to swing from a real emphasis on geopolitical competition to an emphasis on more of the transnational threats. And we've now arrived at a moment where we're having to contend with acute geopolitical competition at the same moment that we have to contend with acute, even existential transnational threats. And those two things do not necessarily sit comfortably side by side because geopolitical competition does squeeze the space for cooperation to solve these challenges. And the nature of these challenges, energy insecurity, food insecurity, technological disruption, a global pandemic can in fact create dynamics that only exacerbate competition on the other side because they fuel greater instability of various forms that bring some degree of entropy into the system. So I would say the thing that walking into this job, I knew it abstractly was going to be a very real strategic reality, that which I've just described. But dealing with it in the concrete, I mean, just the day-to-day, the things that before would have been the top foreign policy issue of the moment might now be number 5 or 6 because of the sheer number of them all unfolding at once. And figuring out how to not get overwhelmed by the inbox, but rather be able to deal with the incoming at the same time that we're actually trying to set out a series of substantial strategic moves to put ourselves in a better position, both on the geopolitics and on the transnational issues. That for me has been, it's been an intense on-the-job training for which no amount of preparation can get you ready. And just trying week by week to continue to adjust, improve, learn, incorporate, the outcomes of both successes and shortcomings, and try iteratively to help give the best possible advice to the president, to organize our decision-making process as effectively as possible, and to, where we can, stay at least one step ahead.
yes, please.
Hi, Sandra Gerber. Is Saudi Arabia our friend? And if they are, how are we showing that?
So Saudi Arabia has been a strategic partner of the United States for 8 decades on a bipartisan basis. The president has made clear that for a variety of factors, we have to reevaluate where this relationship goes from here, and not just operate on inertia, but really take a hard look at the relationship, what it delivers for the United States, what the United States delivers to the relationship. And that also has to happen on a bipartisan basis because fundamentally we're looking for a sustainable platform upon which this relationship can rest going forward. So the president has made clear that he wants to have the opportunity when Congress returns after this election to engage with both Democrats and Republicans and to talk about the best way forward. And he's not taken precipitous action. He's not made any moves sort of shifting us one way or the other in the immediate term. He wants to go methodically, strategically, very carefully through the set of strategic assumptions and strategic lessons that are relevant to this relationship. And then he'll make a series of determinations as a result of that. So I won't get ahead of that, of course, but that's the posture and the perspective that he is bringing to it at this point. And he'll look forward to those consultations and then to what ensues from that.
Thank you. Yes, thanks.
Maybe I'll just go ahead and ask the question.
You can stand up and project your voice.
Thank you, Bob. Interview Bob Das. See you again. I wanted to go back to a point Bob sort of referred to in its introduction, which is the threat to our democracy. Because national security and internal security and our institutions, that's critical to what we do and what we project. Be interested to get your thoughts on that. The risk to our democratic institutions, processes, and basic fundamental rights, voting, votes being counted. I think I'm done. Thank you so much.
The strength and resilience of American democracy is fundamental to who we are as a country, to protecting the institutions and the values that make America, America. And the president has spoken to this, I think, very passionately and eloquently in 2 speeches that he's given over the course of the past several weeks. He fundamentally believes that we are at a critical moment for our country in terms of protecting those institutions and protecting that vision of American democracy and the American democratic experiment. From a national security perspective, I would just make 2 observations. The first is that events like January 6th in some ways reverberated even more intensely around the world than they did in some quarters here at home. Those images, I think, were quite jarring for people who have looked to American democracy as a model and as a constant over the course of the past decades and even longer. And being able to convince both allies and adversaries of our staying power, of our resilience, of our capacity for renewal and regeneration, and that we are going to maintain the reservoir of our national strength that is our democracy. When that gets called into question, that has impacts on our ability to persuade and to rally. And so it's something that I have definitely seen over the course of the past 2 years, having walked into the job 2 weeks after January 6th unfolded. And then the second piece of it is that we are trying in this contest that President Biden has talked about between democracies and autocracies to show that democracy can deliver for its citizens, is the form of government that, whatever its imperfections, is the best form to deliver not just for people's material needs, but for their dignity and for their basic values and rights. And when there are dark forces challenging democracy from within our system, it runs counter to that larger effort to help democracy prevail over the long run. And I see that as well. So those are 2 areas where, sitting in my position, this question about the health and vitality of our democracy come into sharp relief.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. My question is very quick and you can answer very short. Coming from an Indian background and an American citizen, when I speak to the Indian counterpart and other people, their concern is they don't have the ambassador to the immigrants, they will operate the administration. And they even have one in that.
Yes, we would very much like an ambassador, an American ambassador in Delhi. The president has put forward a candidate who has not yet gotten confirmation, but consider this me vigorously advocating on behalf of the swift confirmation of a U.S. ambassador to Delhi, because I could not agree with you more. It's vital that we get someone there. I do want you to know that it is not a reflection of President Biden's personal commitment to the U.S.-India strategic partnership that one isn't there. It is just the result of a very challenging confirmation process.
Yes.
But President Biden himself is engaged with Prime Minister Modi and has directed his team to engage with great frequency with their counterparts. I talked to my counterpart, Ajit Doval, on a very regular basis, including just a few days ago.
Yes.
So the lines of communication, the connections, the partnership is really there, but we've got to fill in that missing piece. And I thank you for giving us a little bit of a push on that.
Thank you.
Last question.
Question is, Russia says it's at war with collective West, and we're saying that Russia's at war with Ukraine. And you mentioned sort of great desire to avoid great binaries in the world, but then there's also a question of sort of moral imperative, and what is the red line at which you stop communicating with people committing war crimes? So how do you balance perhaps those issues? Sure.
Look, if you look back at the history of the Cold War, President Reagan stood up and gave a speech in which he described the Soviet Union as the evil empire. But he was also prepared to sit with his Soviet counterparts in person to negotiate arms control treaties, because he felt that doing so was not some moral compromise. It was not conveying some legitimacy to a system that he called evil, but rather it was to reduce the possibility of an apocalyptic event. And so I think President Reagan's moral clarity combined with his strategic clarity about what it means to be invested with the responsibility of leading national security in the United States drives you to a place where you have to look at diplomacy not as moral approbation, but as an opportunity for you to protect your people and to try to drive to a better outcome. And that's true with the Russians. It's true with the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's true with the DPRK. It's true with the Taliban. And this is not a partisan issue. The Secretary of State in the last administration himself personally sat with the Taliban. I don't think if you had him sitting up here, he would say, well, I wanted to recognize that they were great people who didn't commit war crimes. No, he did it for reasons connected to trying to produce better outcomes for the people he was charged with representing. And so I believe that it is our responsibility to keep lines of communication open, even with our adversaries, so that at the end of the day, we can try to avoid the worst possible outcomes at a minimum and look for opportunities for more. Now, it's not good enough to just say that and kind of leave, you mentioned war crimes, issues like that just off to the side. Heck no. We also have an obligation to pursue accountability. And the United States is doing that, working with the rest of the international community to try to hold the perpetrators of grave and grotesque war crimes in Ukraine responsible for what they have done. And we will continue every day to work on that. I was just in Kyiv on Friday, and I had the opportunity to meet with President Zelensky, with my counterpart, Andriy Yermak, with the military leadership, and also to get a briefing on just what level of death and devastation has been wrought by Putin's war on that country. So I am clear-eyed about who we are dealing with and what we are up against. I do believe that maintaining channels of communication is in the interest of the United States. I also believe it is in the interests of every country who is affected by this conflict.
Can I ask just one add-on to that? And that is, because I know you've got to go to another meeting, but we're having a midterm election. I don't want to ask your thoughts on the midterm, because obviously it's very hard to predict one way or the other, and I don't want to put you in that position anyhow. But the ability to hold this country together and enable us to sustain exactly what you said, and enable the Europeans to do likewise. This is going to be, I suspect, an interesting challenge over coming weeks and months. How do you convince people that this is something that should rise above American politics or European politics for that matter, and really is a question of what the global order looks like 5 and 10 years down the road? Because it seems to me it's going to be a very important challenge to be able to do this, to pull the country together and sustain the kind of commitment that you've just so eloquently described.
Yeah, I mean, this I think it's a responsibility of people across the political spectrum who do, whatever their differences, share a basic view of the kinds of values and vision I've just laid out, to all come together to make the case to their relevant constituencies and stakeholders. So the day before I went to Kyiv, Senator Chris Coons and Senator Rob Portman went on a bipartisan delegation. And Senator Portman has been a clarion voice on supporting Ukraine as a Republican. Leader McConnell has gotten on the phone with President Biden alongside Leader Schumer frequently to talk about what his colleagues, his Republican colleagues, can do to support this effort, which he strenuously believes has to be bipartisan. So we can do our part, but it will require those in the other party, those coming from other perspectives, to also do their part as well. If we do that, I do very firmly believe that on core issues like America's support for the Ukrainian people, we can sustain it, like America's effort to demonstrate that democracy will deliver in the face of greater authoritarian aggression. I think we can sustain those things, but it is by no means a foregone conclusion. It's going to require an intense amount of work by a lot of people, and not just people who all agree with one another on policy issues. A lot of people who fundamentally disagree on a lot of things coming together around this set of issues on which the vast majority of Americans, I believe, do agree.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. As a good friend, we worked together for a number of years in a very not as fraught an environment as the current one, but one where we faced our difficulties. I always admired what you did and how you did it, and I feel the same way now. We are, as a country, I think, are very fortunate to have you in this position, and someone who holds the views you have and can articulate them as thoughtfully as you have, and demonstrate the kind of leadership within the government that you have been able to bring to this job. So thank you very much, Jay.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for
Bob.
joining us.
Coming from you, especially, I do a big job.
And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our programming. Thank you to those online and for those in the room. Hope to see you at General Millie on Wednesday dinner. Thank you.